I think I'd like to start a little bit of personal history here. Now, I attended what was then called the Bear Valley School of Preaching from September of 1973 to May of 1975 there in Denver, Colorado. And as a matter of fact, that's where I met Donna. The school was later known as the Bear Valley Biblical Institute of Denver, and now I believe the website I checked today, it's named itself the Bear Valley Bible Institute International now. But if you look at that building right there, the main structure for worship is back in the back behind that tree there. And then the structure that you see in the foreground is where the classes were taking place. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm thinking back a ways now, but it was in September of 74 that Don and I would have met in that classroom that has the big window right there in the corner. And I remember having a conversation once with her at the door at the bottom, immediately underneath that window. So this structure right here holds a lot of very fond memories for me, where I met my future wife, married in December of 1975. But the reason I bring it all up is because at that time, Norman Gibson, I think long deceased, had made a comment that really stuck with me as a young preacher student all those many years ago. And he said that the most difficult thing in sermon creation or class creation of any kind is not deciding what to say, but what not to say. Now, most of you probably heard a statement similar to that, I suppose. Most preachers, if they're growing at all in their understanding of the Bible, hopefully will know a great deal more than they can ever actually present in a given class, or maybe even an entire series on any given topic. And I'm really feeling that way this week after 2 classes already in Revelation and chapter 20. I spent 2 weeks having just a wonderful time in Tennessee, and yet at the same time, very schizophrenically, I guess, I was tormented the whole time, thought about it every day, about what not to say in Revelation chapter 20. I have just so very much more that I would like to be sharing with you. So very much more that I understand about the book and wish I could be telling you about the book that I just don't have time to do. And I've learned the hard way in the past that when you're dealing with controversial material, people are usually pretty quick to accuse you of hypocrisy, of cowardice, all sorts of things I've been called through the years, because I don't deal with some aspect that they're particularly interested in. I think maybe better fascinated and obsessed with, to the exclusion even of the truth would be my particular opinion when it comes to some of these doctrines. And so, I get accused of a lot. I don't count myself as a coward at all, but I hope I have some sort of semblance of wisdom. I pick and choose the people that I'll engage in public debate with, and some I've refused despite their repeated challenges just because I don't respect them. I don't think that I should dignify their lack of virtue, in my personal opinion, or their doctrine, which doesn't require or need attention really, that I would have to pour into a public debate. But with Revelation chapter 20 particularly, I've really been taken to task. And so I've thought about a third class on Revelation 20, trying to touch all these bases. But there's just too many people who have their own ideas for me to address all of them. So I've thought for 2 weeks about what to do, and I can't just do another whole class, I don't think. And pardon me if I haven't addressed your particular hobby. But I would like to say this about this class now. Let me get this straightened out again. I just got all kinds of problems here with my slideshow tonight. I'm sure I had a hard time. Donna, please come home to me. Things will get better. But what I'd like to address at the outset of chapter 20, and I didn't touch on in the previous 2 classes, is a question that I frequently get clobbered with, is why can't or don't these verses fall under that general time constraint of things that are shortly to come to pass, said two different ways in the first two verses of chapter 1, said 6 times, I believe it is, in chapter 22. And my first answer to that would be that they do fit under the time that's stipulated in chapter 1 and verse 19. And so there it says, write the things which you have seen and the things which are and the things which will take place after these things. When that statement made, it's not limited to things that are shortly to come to pass. And so I believe that the book did not place itself under a restriction that forbids any information that would step outside of things that were shortly to come to pass. So, I get hit with this all the time that I'm not being consistent, but I believe I am. I'm just seeing in the book other statements that clearly require events that were not shortly to come to pass. The vast majority of the book, I'm sure, is about things shortly to come to pass because the context there in those particular visions demands it. But chapter 20 does not demand that. In fact, it won't even allow that. The last few verses of chapter 19, in fact, have stepped beyond things shortly to come to pass, and in keeping then with chapter 1, verse 19, but also, secondly, with chapter 12 and verse 17. Now, the very people who are most strident in charging me with some sort of hypocrisy agree that chapter 12, verse 17 speaks of things all the way down to this day. The dragon was enraged with the woman, went off to make war with the rest of her children. And when we are among the rest of her children, and every realized eschatologist and every other kind of Christian thinks so, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Well, people are still keeping the commandments of God. They're still holding to the testimony of Jesus. And Satan, the dragon, is still enraged with us and makes war with us. The war didn't end in 70 AD. It's continued down to this day. And number 3, they fit certainly under chapter 14 and verse 13, where it says, I heard a voice from heaven saying, write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. People are still dying in the Lord and have been dying in the Lord from then on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. I believe the deeds of Christians for the past 2,000 years, after 70 AD, or nearly 2,000 years, are still following after the saints. And so, get off my back, because those people that are the angriest with me, that I can't go down this road, that I think is a foolish road, and a false doctrine, and a pernicious and evil one, that may well cost you your soul in the end, because it denies resurrection as defined in Scripture, still agree with me that chapter 14, verse 13, was not a thing that ended in the first century, stopped with 70 AD, and therefore would be violating their own charge against me that all things in Revelation have to take place by 70 AD, and that there's nothing in the book that speaks of events after that. And yet, they admit chapter 14, 13 does. The inconsistency, and you want to charge me with cowardice and hypocrisy, is yours, not mine, when you teach that Revelation can't say anything about events that were beyond the time frame of shortly to come to pass. And number 4, I'd like to add a category, and I don't think I invented the term teacher prerogative, but maybe I did. I think there is a right that God retains for himself, that Jesus retained in his own teaching, and we can observe in the Gospels, that Paul reserves, and the other apostles and prophets who wrote the rest of the books of the New Testament, to stipulate that they're going to do this, that, or another thing, and then do that they said they would, and still be permitted, without charges of hypocrisy or cowardice, to add some additional information. What I think is happening under this idea of the teacher's prerogative to fulfill the mission he said he was going to fulfill, things shortly to come to pass, and add some additional information briefly, which context demands, because I believe after these previous 18 and a half chapters, that anybody reading this book in the first century might well come to think that it's talking about the end of the planet. The catastrophes that are described there in such terrifying language might well mislead people into thinking that it was a global discussion. And I think what's happening right here is Jesus, through an angel, is informing John to write these things, and Jesus himself is being revealed in the things that are written, is to take just a few verses here in the last part of 19 and all of chapter 20 to say, but don't worry, the church will endure. There's a lot of time for this old earth to keep spinning on its axis. This is not about the end of the planet. It is about the end of the Old Testament system of things, which we'll have a lot to say in the next couple of classes, or maybe in the second class to come. I think these verses are very comforting for first century saints to know that despite all the terrible things they're going to go through, the great tribulation that they're going to go through, and as I say, these apparently worldwide things, or could be mistaken that way, will leave the old earth behind, allow now what is 2 millenniums of time to take place. Don't worry, it's not the end of the planet. And then in chapter 21 and verse 1, we're going to go right back to discussing things that were already taking place and would continue to take place shortly and down to this very day, as a matter of fact. Now, along these lines, and as you can see, it's realized eschatology that I particularly have in my sights right here, letters that I've received and all kinds of stuff that I want to get into. But I want to introduce you to a guy named Ed Stevens now, very popular, very influential individual who is a realized eschatologist, a covenant eschatologist, a consistent preterist, or whatever of the many terms that they've employed that he particularly picks. I don't know him personally. His website, International Preterist Association, looks like this when you get to the home page. I'm going to show you these two paragraphs right here in a close-up as we think about something that he had to say about Revelation 20, which I think is just utterly incorrect, but I would like to take a little bit of time to address here this evening. Here on the opening page of his website, he has in bold, not bold, but here in large letters, the gospel is at stake, exclamation point. He says, early in 2018, Don Preston and Ed Stevens agreed to a written debate on the topic of the rapture. However, almost immediately, the focus shifted to the death of Adam when Ed realized that Preston's whole CBV resurrection view and all of his argumentation is based on his belief that the kind of death Adam died on that day. Pardon me, I had another notice on my computer, just everything happening. The only kind of death Adam died on the day he sinned was spiritual death. And if Adam only died spiritually on that day, then Christ's substitutionary death to overcome the death of Adam had to be spiritual only also. And not only, Ed says, downplays the significance of the physical death of Jesus, but totally eliminates Christ's physical death from his substitutionary atoning death. Now, it's not even this paragraph that I really want to deal with, so don't worry about all that verbiage right there, some of which might be fairly confusing to you. Let me just at this point go to a different website, at least to identify the CBV resurrection view, which most of you probably never heard of, don't know what he's talking about. But here at a different website, Fulfilled Magazine, Volume 13, Issue 3, by one David Clark, about whom I know nothing, but under the title Resurrection, Where Do CBV and IBV First Part Ways? David Clark says, of the many points over which, let's do this. Maybe that'll help you viewers. Of the many points, it should have been a space there, of the many points over which preterists divide, arguably the greatest is the nature of the resurrection. The preterist community, by and large, is divided into camps. The corporate body view, there's your CBV, and the individual body view, IBV. Both of these views are themselves further divided into various components, as not all of the respective proponents of a particular view agree on all the details. Over the years, it seems that the division has become more polarized to the extent that I've even heard the H word, heresy, alluded to. Unfortunately, in our modern era of social media, it's very easy for the facts we read or hear to be second or third hand. In light of the current written debate between Don Preston and Ed Stevens regarding the nature of the rapture, which touches upon but does not directly address the resurrection, I think it timely to complement their debate with similar interaction regarding the resurrection. So, in quote, I'd like to say for my viewers here is that corporate body view, individual body view, great debate's been raging for a couple of decades now as I've been watching these people who are very fond of raging debates and engage in them frequently. A very divided bunch of people, so sure they've got all the answers and yet can't agree among themselves. It's been amazing to me to watch for 34 years now, how militantly sure they are that everybody else who agrees with them is wrong. It's just comical. So there's a CBV view and the IBV and the resurrection. They're redefining all of these realized eschatologists as, they're redefining resurrection as having nothing to do with bodies coming out of tombs. So I disagree with all of them. Certainly bodies will come out of tombs. There is a future resurrection that lies ahead, and we'll be discussing that in some future lessons. For now, though, and sorry about that again, I still got to switch over here to get that to work. The other paragraph on Ed Stevens' website says, in February of 2018, so this is 3 years old now, Don Preston and Ed Stevens agreed to debate the rapture. It's a written debate, each section to be posted on Facebook as it becomes visible. Preston is defending his proposition first, already submitted his first 3 affirmatives. Stevens likewise submitted his first 3 negatives. If you wish to follow the progress of the debate, join the Preterist Debate group on Facebook. So there you go. But I want to see these two faces, main reason I brought it up. Here's a Don Preston and Ed Stevens. These two men, very powerful, very influential, very bright, very capable, very persuasive, and absolutely wrong in my view. Tonight I'm not going to be talking about Don Preston. I want to focus on Ed Stevens and just wanted you to see his face, see that they can't agree among themselves either on some of the most basic and pivotally important aspects of realized eschatology. Just another sign in my view that realized eschatology cannot be so, is not so. But I wanted to take up one point here this evening from Revelation 20 from Stevens. Last August, he sent me 7 articles. Among them were such topics as these: what the rabbis taught about the millennium. He means rabbis in the Torah, the Midrash, other writings that have nothing to do with Christ. They're not Christians. They're uninspired and unbelievers. So he sent, in fact, there's a couple of places where he takes up these rabbis in the material that Ed sent me. Number 2, the binding of Satan. Number 3, the purpose of binding Satan. Number 4, the first resurrection. Number 5, the millennial reign of Christ. Number 6, when was Satan released? Number 7, the war against the saints, which you'll see he identifies as taking place in 64 through 66 AD. Now you can see that all these things are coming out of Revelation 19 and 20. And he sent me all this stuff back in August when I was just starting Revelation. Well, I hope he stuck with me and paid attention to everything I've had to say. I rather doubt that he did, but hopefully he didn't jump the gun and off the horse and all of that. Sent me all this material about Revelation 20 40 weeks ago, and maybe he's going to tune in, to hear what I have to say here. We'll see. But they're really fascinated about this stuff. He knows I don't agree with him on this stuff. And so even before I got started in the first chapter, even before I got started on my introductory lessons, he wanted to, hit me with this. Well, I read it, and not the first time, and it's junk. Here's why. This war against the saints that he says from chapter 20 encompasses only 3 years. He says like this, quote, Satan used the Jews to deceive Nero into blaming the fire of Rome upon the Christians. Now, Ed, if you're listening, I'd really like to see the source material for that idea. I confess my complete ignorance. I had no idea the Jews had such control over Nero. I had no idea the Jews were so influential in Nero's court. I had no idea they could change his mind, that they could deceive him, and that the poor man was at a loss what to do about that fire in Rome. And lo and behold, he needed the Jews to come and tell him, wait, why don't you blame it on the Christians? I'd never seen anything like that. So if that's my own ignorance, it won't be the first time. I have towering ignorance in a wide range of things. But I'd sure like to see the source material for that idea. So here he says, Satan used the Jews to deceive Nero into blaming the fire of Rome upon the Christians. And Nero implemented that suggestion immediately. So he said, okay, well, you Jews, I got to do what you think. So he went ahead and did it. This very effectively, says Ed, launched the final war upon the church. Parenthesis, he says AD 64 through 66. Did you know that there's been no more war by Satan against the church since 66 AD? What? That's big news to me. I've 3 times had people threaten my life, death threats, 3 times. None of them realize eschatologists, I might add. But I've said some fairly controversial things that the Mormons didn't like, and a number of denominational people didn't like, and I know what it is to have concerns. I turned 3 of those death threats over to the police. I was seriously concerned about this, so I didn't have any idea that the final war upon the church, ended in 66 AD. Satan was done with us. Then he continues, when that great tribulation had pretty well run its course and eliminated most of the saints. Did you know that most of Christ's people were killed in the 3 years of 64, 65, and 66? Well, I'd never read that in any history, inspired or uninspired. But Ed's here to tell us that most of the saints died, were killed, is what I understand to mean. They were eliminated because the Jews had persuaded Nero to blame the fire on them. Now, Christ came in judgment upon the Jews, he adds, and that war, the Great Tribulation, was cut short when the Jews, I probably got to go full screen again, this will mess me up. There you go. Let me start in the middle, right after the Christ came in judgment upon the Jews. That war, he continues, the Great Tribulation was cut short when the Jews rebelled against the Romans. So the Great Tribulation stopped because the Jews had convinced Nero, deceived him, to blame the fire in Rome on the Christians, which killed most of the Christians. And then Nero went and destroyed the Jews when they rebelled against the Romans. So now Nero is not listening to him anymore much, I guess. And then he says Christ came to rescue his remaining living saints, apparently few of them. I continue now the quote. Immediately after that tribulation, Matthew 24, 29 through 31, and to pour out his wrath upon the Jews. Now I highlighted in yellow, the yellow highlighting is my own. Thus ended the Messiah's millennial reign. Well, did you know that? The millennial reign ended in 66 AD. Thus ended the Messiah's millennial reign when all of his enemies were completely shattered, including the final enemy, death itself. And the rest of the dead were raised out of Hades and judged. Well, brethren, I just have to tell you, that all of that is just a whole lot of news to me. So I don't think really any of this in uninspired history, and I can't find it in biblical history, and I just can't find it in any history. But this is what Ed Stevens teaches. And so what he's teaching is that the millennium of chapter 20 that we've already spent 2 weeks on is ended in 66 AD. The 1,000 years took place in 40 years, is what the rest of the material he was sending me said, and what others who shall remain nameless, but you know who you are, also attacked me vigorously, that I wouldn't allow 1,000 years to fit into 40. So I just want to think about this a little bit. Just a few paragraphs later in the material Ed sent me, he said, that perfectly corresponds with the Jewish rabbinical idea of the Messiah's millennium being a transitionary period in the last days. I want to emphasize that. And the material he sent me begins and ends with the foundation being the uninspired and faithless writings of rabbis who never came to Christ. This is what Ed builds his theory. Millennium, 1,000 years, equals 40 literal years that end in 70 AD, yet, he now said in the previous letter 64 through 66, so I'm sure I don't understand everything he says, and I don't mean to misrepresent him in any way. Don't burn my phone lines down again. But his foundation is uninspired and faithless rabbis. He begins and ends there. These guys don't mean much to me and don't carry a lot of weight. Well, they don't carry any weight, really. And then he starts the millennium during the ministry of Christ in 26 AD is when he starts the millennium, and not after Rome falls in 1920 as our context says. And he turns that symbolic 1,000 years into a literal 40 years. Now, I think the 1,000 is symbolic because I have reason to. Contextual reason in Revelation 20 and precedent in the Old Testament where the expression means more than 1,000 literal years, but the fullness of whatever's under view. So when God is said in Psalm 50, I believe it is, that he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, there are millions of hills on this earth that cattle have roamed. And God owns the cattle on all of them. 1,000 is symbolic there, and it's symbolic in Revelation 20. And it means more than 1,000 literal, not less, and certainly not 40. So there's a great deal more about Stephen's teaching that I could address and is utterly wrong. I just want tonight to say he, has built on sand, out of sand. He's got nothing but sand. In his whole castle, as elaborate and beautiful as it is, persuasive that has misled a fair number of people, is just mush. It's not so. It's not so because of what we studied last week. In 19 and 20, and actually in 17 and 18 here, the harlot falls. Babylon, the harlot, is Jerusalem. That happens when Jerusalem falls in 70 AD. 19:1 through 6, though, follows that. A chronological progression now begins. The rejoicing is not before the harlot falls. I don't think it was even during the harlot's fall of the 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 42 months of the Roman invasion. But when it was all over, saints had reason to rejoice. And in 19:7 through 10, it's then that the supper begins. This is a progression from one to the other. And then in verses 11 through 19, the war begins. And Satan still hates the children of the woman and the offspring of the woman. And he's still killing the saints, but their works are still following after them because the war is still going on in 12:17 and 14:13. Now, I put on my chart in 19, 20, and 21, Rome falls. And we can argue about, the date. I picked 476. There's lots of others that are mostly clustered around 476. But that supper didn't end in 70 AD. It has continued all the way through, as has the war. That's certain in the context. So now I take the same conceptual idea, but we start here with Rome's fall in 476, 19, 20, and 21. And we moved in last week to chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. Satan is bound. I see that as chronologically taking place after Rome falls in 476 AD. 24 through 6, we have a first resurrection taking place then, and the beginning of the 1,000 years, after which in 27 through 9, Satan will be released for a short time in 20 verse 3, followed in verses 10 through 15 by final judgment. My teaching, which harmonizes with both the scriptural use of the 1,000 years, harmonizes with the prophecies in their context, and harmonizes with real world history, none of which is true of realized eschatology. My view sees a future judgment has not taken place, which will likely be the subject of classes after I finish this Revelation series in the next few weeks. So there's my view. And all I'm trying to say in this first half, this class, 38 minutes now, is that Ed, you're wrong. And Don, you're wrong. And it doesn't matter what view you guys take in all your debates, you're both wrong on your overall view. And those of you that have fallen prey to this view, you need to see your way out of it. You really need to come back. They got over enthusiastic. They saw some true things in Revelation, and they got carried away and ran off the cliff. And I'm sorry. You need to come back from that cliff. So I can't deal with it all. I'm not interested in dealing with it all. I'm not going to deal with it all, but I can. And I have, and I'll continue to stand against it. So tonight now, let's continue as we look in Revelation 21:1 through 22:6. I want to read the next vision. And what I'm suggesting to you is that after this brief foray into the long period of world history, which is longer than 1,000 literal years and has endured down to this day and will continue to a final judgment in our future. The next thing that happens is this vision of the new heavens and the new earth, in which we step right back from the brief discussion of things that were in the far distant future back to things that were currently taking place, were in the near future, and would continue. This marriage supper of the Lamb and the new heavens and the new earth. So now I want to just read for you chapter 21, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 6. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he shall dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be among them. And he shall wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall no longer be death. There shall no longer be mourning, or crying, or pain. The first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. And he said, Write, for these words are faithful and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. He who overcomes shall inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and fornicators and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I shall show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Her brilliance was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. It had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names written on them, which are of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. 3 gates on the east, and 3 gates on the north, and 3 gates on the south, and 3 gates on the west. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And the one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its wall. And the city is laid out as a square, and its length is as great as its width. And he measured the city with the rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. And he measured its wall 72 yards, human measurements, which are angelic. And the material of the wall was jasper, and the city was pure gold like clear glass. The foundation stones of the city wall were adorned with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation stone was jasper, the second sapphire, the third chalcedony, the fourth emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth sardius, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each one of the gates was a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold like transparent glass. And I saw no temple in it. For the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need of the sun or of the moon to shine upon it, for the glory of God has illumined it, and its lamp is the Lamb. And the nations shall walk by its light, and the kings of the earth shall bring their glory into it. And in the daytime, for there shall be no night there, its gates shall never be closed, and they shall bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. And nothing unclean, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. And he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb, in the middle of its street. And on either side of the river was the tree of life, bearing 12 fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And there shall no longer be any curse. And the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his bondservants shall serve him. And they shall see his face and his name on their foreheads. And there shall no longer be night, and they shall not have need of the light of a lamp, nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God shall illumine them, and they shall reign forever and ever. And he said to me, these words are faithful and true, and the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, sent his angel to show to his bondservants the things which must shortly take place. And I'm going to pause the reading there for just a moment, only to say, I hope you get it, that all realized eschatology is false. We have now gone back, starting in 21:1, to things which will shortly take place, and even are taking place. The bride's been introduced back in 19 and 20. And so, the millennium did not end in 70 AD when the harlot was burnt and destroyed by Rome, eaten by Rome. That did not end that millennium. In 66 AD, as Ed Stevens teaches, he starts in 26. The millennium didn't end in 70 AD either. The millennium, even if you say it started in 70 AD, I'd be fine with that, has continued, as has the war against the saints and the bride against whom these people war. Christ is still making war, and Satan is still making trouble in war to this day. So, brethren, there is an interlude in the book of Revelation, starting back in chapter 19, and especially here, I would say, at verse 17 and following, and then throughout all of verse 15. You can call it 18 verses if you want to start at verse 18. You can call it 19. I've argued with myself if you want to go back a few verses earlier, chapter 19. I don't care. There's only a very small percentage of the book of Revelation that is outside things that are shortly to come to pass. But these verses are them. And that bride is still here. And that supper is still open. The gates of the city are never closed, as we'll be studying in more detail next week. So as we close tonight, in these last 10, 15, 20, 30, or 45 minutes, as we'll discover, I want to now try to bring all of this even more into focus by recognizing that after we have gone from things that were shortly to take place and which culminated in the fall of the temple in 70 AD, then we have this interlude of things that will continue all the way down to a final judgment which hasn't happened yet in 19 and 20. We've now returned in chapter 21 to the bride and the New Jerusalem, pardon me, the new heavens and the new earth, which continue down to this day. And I want to introduce you to this man. I hope most of you will recognize his face instantly. I believe this man to be the greatest preacher of the 20th century. I believe this man to be the greatest scholar of the 20th century. This man's name, as you see him there in his study in Tucson, Arizona, is Homer Haley. Homer Haley was a friend of mine. Not a close friend, but a man that I spoke with more times than I can count, I guess. And was just an absolutely brilliant mind. He held more meetings than anybody else among Christians of that century, so near as I can tell. He's a man who taught at Abilene Christian before it was a university. He's a man who taught at Florida College and has a dormitory named after him. He's the head of Bible departments in both of those colleges and universities. And is a man who's just of unparalleled brilliance, wisdom, knowledge, scholarship. This man, Homer Haley, is a man that I just cannot recommend highly enough. His commentary on Isaiah, which I believe is the book you see on his desk there. Mine has that same blue cover and thickness on its back cover there, but I think that's his commentary on Isaiah. And brethren, I got a bunch of commentaries on Isaiah, but that's the one to have. That's the one, that really gets it. You can only afford to buy one, or you only want to read one. That'd be the one to have. Homer's commentary on Isaiah. This man knew what he was talking about in 65 books of the Bible. And I told him so to his face, and I disagreed with him on that last book, 66th book. Now, Homer died in November of 2000. He was 97 years old, and this may be, for all I know, the last photograph that was ever taken of him, standing out there in that field and outside of Tucson, Arizona. He wrote a commentary in 1979 entitled The Book of Revelation, an introduction and commentary by Homer Haley. That's the cover of the copy that I own. In chapter 21 of this commentary on Revelation, which corresponds with the chapter 21 we've just read a few moments ago, he says this in his opening paragraph under the eternal glory. I'm going to not only zoom in on that single paragraph, but I will go full screen for you now. He says this as he opens up his commentary on Revelation 21. To most believers, the next section of the book, Revelation 21:1 through 22:5, I just read it for you, continuing the quote now, is a portrayal of heaven, the glorious home of the soul beyond the judgment. Now, let me break from his comments just to say, I don't believe that. I am not among those believers. I agree entirely with this first sentence. Most believers think that. Most believers are incorrect. And I think Homer's incorrect. But it is popular. I read again from the start. To most believers, the next section of the book, 21:1 through 22:5, is a portrayal of heaven, the glorious home of the soul beyond the judgment. Through the centuries, this concept has comforted the hearts of millions during times of trial, tragedy, and death of loved ones. Today, aside from millenarian views, two views are usually held with respect to the vision. One is that the city described is the victorious church as God considers it today, purged and purified by the tribulation through which it has passed. Now I want to pause the quoting there. That's my view. Homer has just identified in his commentary on Revelation from 1979 my view, which I didn't believe in 1979. I believed Homer's view in 1979. I changed. I now believe that the city described as the victorious church as God considers it today, purged and purified by the tribulation through which it has passed. Now to continue the quote from Homer. A second view is that the vision portrays the church at home with God in final glory beyond the judgment. Though it is true that the faithful church is glorious in the Lord's eyes, and in this vision is seen blessings present throughout the history of God's people. Yet, after considering the evidence for both views, the latter seems to be the correct one. End quote. Homer mentions both prevailing views among Christians. He's laying aside, all the hogwash in the denominational world that's even more popular. Popularity doesn't make it right. I guess I should come back here now. Popularity certainly does not make anything right, never has. So he names the two views, but he picks view number 2. And to his dying day, he stayed there. I happen to know. And from personal conversation. And, in fact, when I told him I disagreed with him, he said, well, you've got a lot to learn. I chuckled then and I chuckle now. And he had a right, a much older man than I am, to say such a thing. It wasn't condescending and it wasn't demeaning. But I used to believe what Homer taught, and then toward the end of his life, I told him I didn't anymore. I took the first view. Now, let's think about this for a minute. And again, I got to do this in order to do that. I want to read another paragraph right here, now from page 405. I've been reading from page 404 in the commentary. This is page 405. Once again, I'm going to go full screen for you here. He says now on the next page, this passing of the old order and instituting a new one is more clearly announced by Isaiah in chapter 65. Now, end quote. and remember, he's still teaching Revelation. This is in chapter 21 of his Revelation commentary. Now, he says in verse 1, and then I'll just continue reading his quote, in the first sentence, and I'll continue reading. This passing of the old order and instituting a new one is more clearly announced by Isaiah in chapter 65. Jehovah says that the former troubles are forgotten, being hid from his eyes. They shall not be remembered nor come into mind in Isaiah 65 verses 16 and 17. They shall have passed away. In the place of the old, God says, quote, I create new heavens and a new earth, end quote, in which he shall rejoice in Jerusalem and his people, and they shall rejoice in him. Isaiah 65 verses 17 through 19. It is evident from the remainder of that chapter that the Lord is speaking of the new order under Christ in contrast to the old under the law. Quote, they shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, end quote, from verse 25 of Isaiah 65, which is Zion of Messiah's rule in Isaiah 2 verses 2 through 4. Isaiah, Homer says, Isaiah was not writing of the new heaven and new earth of John's vision, but of the new creation and order under Christ, the present dispensation. This new order of the new covenant would remain, and in it the seed and name would likewise remain. Worship and victory would not cease in Isaiah 66, verses 22 through 24. The New Testament system is composed of new creatures, 2 Corinthians 5:17, Galatians 6:15, involving a new divine creation which is after God, Ephesians 2:10 and 4:24. Okay, now do you get what I'm showing you? I'm showing you that in Homer's Revelation commentary from 1979, he says there's two views of the new heaven and new earth in Revelation 21. And Isaiah taught the first view in chapters 65 and 66 of Isaiah. But Homer believes that the same terminology in Revelation is not about what Isaiah said. It's about heaven instead of what Isaiah said. Now, again, I want to show you this portion of that last paragraph I just read to you. And again, this time with my own font, I want you to see this full screen. Homer says in his Revelation commentary, Isaiah was not writing of the new heaven and new earth of John's vision. Pardon me, I've got more to that. There it is. Isaiah was not writing of the new heaven and new earth of John's vision, but of the new creation and order under Christ, the present dispensation. So in other words, what he says in Isaiah is that the new heavens and new earth of Isaiah represents the church. And he says that in his Revelation commentary. But that John is not talking about that when he speaks of the new heavens and new earth. John's talking about heaven instead. So now I want to show you Homer's commentary on Isaiah. We're going to zoom in again to this part, the new heavens and the new earth, in his Isaiah commentary from chapter 65 of Isaiah, verses 17 through 25. The coming of the Messiah, Homer says, will introduce a new spiritual and moral order or arrangement. Paul calls this new order a dispensation, an arrangement of the fullness of the times, when all things will be summed up, brought together under one head in Christ, Ephesians 1:10. Isaiah's new heavens and new earth are the new arrangement to which Paul refers, and before which all old dispensations must pass away. read afresh the comments in Homer's commentary on Isaiah 34 verses 3 through 4, chapter 51 verse 6, and chapter 51 verse 16. So brethren, I'm leaving it full screen. All I am saying is that I agree completely with Homer in Isaiah. He is absolutely right. And so far as I know, virtually every Christian believes that too. Now again, I'm not talking about denominational doctrine. Let the Catholics and Lutherans and the Baptists and everybody else teach what they will. Homer was a Christian. He taught differently. In Isaiah, I agree with Homer. The new heavens and the new earth represents the church on earth today. But I wish he'd use this language consistently in both Isaiah and Revelation. So I'm going to leave you again with the little girl tonight that I've showed you so many times before. 3 times before, I think it is. Just to say that for your last opportunity this week, be reading chapter 19 through 22. And I read most of it for you tonight of Revelation. And be reading Isaiah 60 through 66. As we turn next week to decide, do you think Homer is right? That in Isaiah, the new heavens and new earth refers to the church on earth. But in Revelation, the new heavens and new earth does not refer to the church on earth. It rather refers to going to heaven after a final judgment, which Homer says has not happened yet. Now, I agree that final judgment has not happened yet. He's right on that too. What he's incorrect on is using the identical terminology in Isaiah that is found in Revelation to speak of two totally different things that have now been separated by at least 2,000 years and counting. Now, if you really want to get to what I'll do next week, please read not just 60, but start in 54 of Isaiah and read all the way down through 66. It's a lot. I'm trusting you to be serious Bible students. You're not flippant, you're not careless, you're not negligent, you're not lazy. You've been 41 weeks with me, and by my count, only 2 of those classes went less than an hour, and they were both of them 50 minutes plus. I believe you're serious. I believe you're advanced students. I believe you're college level students. I believe you can do homework. I believe you want to understand what Revelation teaches, and you're not going to settle for the shallow stuff that I've had to endure most of my life when I listen to my brethren teach on Revelation. Clearly, they don't know what they're talking about. And they don't do a deep dive because they can't go that deep. I think that's just what it is. When you go deep, you actually read what I'm asking you to read. It becomes undeniable in the fullness of the experience of all the data on the subject. Now, I know that's a big thing to say. Homer's gone. I loved him. I agreed with him with just almost everything he ever taught. But just to tease you a little bit, at the very end of his life, he finally came over to my side on something he had taught his entire life until just the last year or two. And it's a cardinal, major, gigantic principle kind of a thought. But he changed his mind because he was growing. I'm asking you to do the same. I believe, knowing Homer, if he'd lived longer, he would have come over to this view on Revelation. I think he would have seen the consistency in Isaiah and Revelation. He didn't live that long, but he was a good Bible student growing till the day he died, and I am standing on a monstrous Bible student's shoulders. I'm just saying. He was right on most things. He was right in Isaiah. He should have seen the same thing in Revelation that he saw in Isaiah. And I like to think he would have if he just lived to be 105. But God called him home. Now, while you yet live, come on over. Get out of realized eschatology if you've been deceived by that. See the progression in 19 and 20, outside things that are shortly to come to pass. Recognize that a millennium is not 40 years. And that historical progression brings us down to a bride and an open kingdom represented as a new heaven and a new earth into which the Gentiles can still come, that is depicted in great detail throughout 21 and first 5 or 6 verses of 22. Read Isaiah 54 through 66 like you're serious about understanding Revelation, and you will understand Revelation. I love you all. Are you born with me this far? Quote Dylan yet again, stick with me, baby.